Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Had a lovely email from Arden Merkin. They really enjoyed the show and were happy that I picked up on a number of things as a balance of the spirit and spirit to oak, shall we say, and things like that. So yeah, everything's happy, everybody's happy, and that's what I aim to do. I like to please everybody if possible. Obviously, I don't, as you well know, sort of blow smoke up anyone's ass. I always give what I think is a balanced appraisal of the whiskies, and it seems to me that distilleries are quite happy and, you know, with that kind of thing. You know, they would rather have sort of, you know, a kind of, you know, a good, honest appraisal as opposed to somebody, you know, saying everything is brilliant, because what's the point in that? You know, at the end of the day, nobody learns from that. But anyway, this week's episode of the show is kind of a bit like last week's episode of the show, insofar that it does take me a little bit of time to sort of gather together samples from the Lochlea Distillery, as we're doing, and I'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone at the distillery for all the samples for today's episode of the show. So yes, it takes me a little while, and I actually thought that I had done an episode on Lochlea before, because it's a distillery that I've grown very fond of, it has to be said, over the years, but it turns out I hadn't. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty certain that I've used the R barley, their sort of standard release, in an episode of the show. I probably did an episode of the show on New Lowland distilleries or something of that kind of ilk, I would imagine, at some stage, because for years it was a region of Scotland I think was criminally overlooked by people investing in distilleries, and, you know, the Speyside and Highlands and Isla were all sort of like, you know, in places, but, you know, the lowlands were sort of really sort of, you know, underrepresented until relatively recently, and then now there's been a plethora of distilleries cropping up, you know, sort of new distilleries like Lochlea and Lindores and Glasgow and Eden Mill and so on and so forth, which is lovely to see. So a little bit of background about the Lochlea Distillery. Apparently it was back in 2014 when plans were hatched for the distillery by a chap called Neil McGough. I do sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly, and one imagines it was the usual chat in the pub over a pint. I can't imagine it was in a sauna, because, well, they're not in Sweden. It might have been over the kitchen table, possibly, because the distillery itself was built on or in a farm, a working farm, and the farm is found in, and I'm not going to pronounce the name of where it is because I'm going to murder it, and I don't have a Scottish accent, so I've just already probably murdered Neil's name. But anyway, so in East Ayrshire, and apparently the area resonates with history, shall we say, as they often do, of a certain Mr. Rabbie Burns. It seems like every distillery under the sun in Scotland seems to claim some kind of affinity with the bard, as they say, although Lochlea does have a pretty strong claim to fame, as Robert Burns actually worked and lived there from 1777 to 1784. Not entirely sure what work he did, apart from obviously writing, but he worked there apparently. But the nice thing about it is that the distillery don't make a big deal about it, which is really good, because a lot of distilleries do tend to sort of milk this kind of history, shall we say, but you wouldn't really know it, apart from, I think, the sort of little, the logo features a saying from Burns or something like that about fearing no work and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, so the farm had converted apparently to barley production some years before, and high quality barley, which was used in the distilling industry. And I guess they must have sort of thought, well, you know, we've got good barley, why not? So 4 years later, and £6 million, which is actually pretty cheap for a distillery. I always thought a minimum of 10 to build a distillery, but apparently they built it on the cheap. Maybe certain bits of it held together with spitting bogies, as they say. So yes, 6 million quid, and they have a distillery. And not only did they have a distillery, one imagines Neil was not mucking about when he brought in some real heavyweights of the industry to sort things out. So the distillery manager, or was the distillery, I don't know whether Malcolm's still there now, I probably should have asked the question anyway. So yes, so you've got in Malcolm Rennie, who obviously has worked at a number of distilleries including Ardbeg and Bruichladdich and Kilchoman, and production manager was the ex-Lefroy distillery manager, John Campbell. So like I said, no mucking about here, it's going to be done properly. And I hate to say, what do you mean I hate to say? I have to say, I love to say, they indeed do it properly. This is what I love about sort of some of the newer lowland distilleries. They produce this lovely fruity estery style of spirit. Now yes, it's probably done because they want to get it out there as soon as possible, but you know, it's the style of whiskey that really appeals to me. And certainly one of the other interesting things that the distillery decided to do was they wanted to sort of do 4 releases per year, which kind of reflected the seasons on the farm. Now you could probably say, well, that's a little bit gimmicky, and I think the distillery have realised that, I mean, I love it, I think it's a brilliant idea, but I think the distillery have realised that they don't really want to be sort of like, hamstrung is the wrong word, but sort of welded, I suppose, or wedded, maybe a better word, to this kind of concept. So I'm looking at sort of the second batch of the releases, and we're now getting into the third batch, which will be the final series of releases that are tied to the seasons of the farm. And I don't know quite what their plans are moving forward, but I guess the thing is that when you do something like this, like I said, it kind of like it almost kind of stops you sort of doing other things, because you've got to make these particular bottlings. So by finishing these releases, they're kind of giving themselves a little bit more flexibility. So basically, as I said, so they wanted to represent the 4 seasons on the farm. So we have the Sowing edition, which is basically wholly aged in ex-bourbon, or the spirit is wholly aged in ex-bourbon, to sort of basically sort of represent the sort of fresh distillery character, the freshness of the Sowing season. The second is the Harvest edition, which basically features spirit that's been aged in port, sherry and bourbon. So, and this is another thing I like about the distillery, they're not afraid to play around with these specific types of casks, but again, all about the balance really, isn't it? The third release is Fallow, which is basically, they wanted to represent sort of the leaving of the earth, to sort of like regenerate, that kind of thing. And the final release was Ploughing. Now Ploughing, they wanted to basically sort of, I don't know, get the feeling of the earth being sort of moved and tilled and things like that. And so they opted to use, or wanted to include, some peat. Now of course, obviously, like a lot of distilleries, if you're going to go and do a peated run, it's quite time consuming. You've got to do it at the end of the season, so you can basically clean everything out. But they decided to go down the similar route to a number of other distilleries, like Farley Bay, for example, or the Spirit of Yorkshire Distillery, I should give them their proper title, and use ex-peated casks. And having your ex-Lefroy distillery manager, I wonder where those casks came from. So I know the first batch they did of the Ploughing had both casks and quarter casks. Now I think batch number 2, or second crop as they called it, actually only featured casks rather than the quarter casks. Now also, so like I said, distillery was up and running 4 years later in 2018, and now they have got to the point of releasing age tables. It's like kind of, wow, the distillery is almost 7. It's like kind of that sort of, where the hell did that time go? So we've also got 2 of their age statement releases as well to look at. So really looking forward to that. And like I said, it's a distillery that I have really grown quite fond of, and it's because the sort of the character of the spirit is the sort of stuff that I like. So really looking forward to this, and if you've not heard of Lochlea before, hopefully by the end of it you'll know a bit about it. Well, you should know a bit about it now because I've just told you about it. Anyway, let's have a look at today's show. Right, okay, so we're going to kick off with obviously the Sowing, because it's the obvious place to start. This bottled at 46%. Obviously we're not going to have any issues with ABVs and chill filtration at all today, like last week. So bottled at 46%, all aged in first fill bourbon. So we're going to get, hopefully, all of the distillery character, and then we will be able to see whether we can pick up the distillery character throughout the rest of the bottlings. Number 2 obviously is Harvest. This is also bottled at 46%, and as I said earlier, aged in a combination of port, STR and bourbon casks. Number 3 is obviously the Fallow edition, so to basically represent the whole point of the fields being left to their own devices. It's been aged, the spirit's been aged wholly in Oloroso and Pedro Ximenez casks. As you can see, fairly dark, so we'll see whether the distillery character kind of stands up to that, won't we? And as I said earlier, the final bottling in the quartet is the Ploughing, so aged in ex-Lefroy bourbon casks and bottled at 46%. Right, okay, so then we're going to move on. This kind of did have a bit of a challenge, because obviously we've got a peated one here in the middle, and we're now going to, well, I say peated one, a spirit aged in peated casks, and then we're going to sort of go on the 2 age statement bottlings, which obviously don't have any peat character whatsoever. So it was, do I move them around, or do I, and I thought, well, I'll stick with the seasons, and then we'll do the 2 age statements. So this is the first release, which was last year, a 5-year-old bottle of 50%, and it featured 6 casks, 2 first fill bourbon casks, cask number 20 and 25, a first fill ex Pedro Ximenez cask, cask number 249, a double matured ex Oloroso cask. Not quite sure what double matured is, but maybe it's obviously, maybe it's refill, possibly. That's maybe what they meant. So it's cask number 272, and a double matured ex Pedro Ximenez cask. Again, I'm assuming it's just their terminology for a refill PX cask, cask number 295. Like I said, bottled at 50%. And the last bottling of the day is the current, or the last release, which was released in January. I mean, why do they release them in January? Nobody's, I mean, it's good that the distillery has quite a following, because you know I go, my God, you're releasing something in January, and it's not a cheap bottling, it has to be said, and we've just done Christmas. Anyway, I seem to sell them because, like I said, the distillery has quite a following. So the 6-year-old, slightly different, and so there is just a vatting of 3 first fill bourbon casks, number 132, 135 and 138, and 3 Oloroso sherry butts, 250, 251 and 252. So looking forward to that, to see whether, or indeed how much distillery character actually remains after all of that sherry. So right, I'm feeling a little bit dry. I think I've rabbited for far too long, as they say. So let's do a bit of tasting, shall we? Right, okay, so kicking things off with the Sowing edition, 100% first fill bourbon matured. Nice, that's a lovely nose. Quite fresh, quite citric, quite barleyed, minerally. I get a lot of mineral, a lot of sort of crisp citric minerals. Subtly estery. I don't think the sort of Can't remember how long the fermentation actually is. I mean, I think they have a fairly long fermentation. I think they're up into the 90 plus hours, and it has a restrained estery character. So white fruits, pear, peach, green apple. It's got like I said, it's got this lovely complexity for such a young spirit. It's got minerality. It's got oiliness. Yes, the oak is definitely there as well, and although it's first fill oak, we're not talking mountains of oak. It's got a nice toffee note coming through with a little bit of tannin as well. It's just beautifully balanced. It is absolutely fantastic. This is the sort of whiskey that floats my boat, as they say. See what the pass like. That's got a lovely progression. It kicks off with a lovely estery fruit, more estery fruit, fuller, more fleshier, sort of hints of banana, white fruit, apple, quite mineral sort of on the mid palate. That sort of citrus and minerality sort of kicks in and lingers throughout into the finish, and then finally the oak kicks in with a little bit of creaminess, toffee. There's a little bit of sort of rose petal on the finish, but it's not spirity. It's got a lovely intensity, 46%, just the right ABV. I think if that had been bottled a little higher at 50, for example, I think it might have made the finish a little bit too austere. So I think 46% is just absolutely perfect for that. Beautifully balanced, it has to be said, and just a lovely whiskey to start with. Right, okay, so moving on to the harvest. So this features bourbon, port and STR casks. Right, so I'm getting quite a lot of STR to start off with, sort of red fruits, tannins, a little bit of a porty black fruit comes through next, some vanilla. And again, there's that minerality, that freshness, that citric minerality, a little bit of earth. Now the casks are quite heavy on this, but I am getting a little bit of barley notes coming through. There is some spirit. So overall, again, I think the balance is pretty good, it has to be said. And this is the thing, when you're playing around with a number of different cask types, that's what you want. You want each individual cask to add an element. You don't want it just to be sort of like, well, all I can taste is the STR or the sherry or whatever, you know. This is just really nicely balanced, like I said. So it kind of, like I said, opens up with the STR cask, moves into the port, then we get a bit of distillery character, we get that sort of minerality, that freshness, but we also get a little bit of estery fruit as well. See what that's like. A bit grippy on the finish, but again it kind of moves in pretty much the same way as the nose does. So it kind of opens up with the STR red fruits and porty black fruits. It's a little rawness possibly on the mid palate as the spirit kind of kicks in. There's a little bit of rose petal, but it's got a beautifully minerally and citric kind of finish with a little bit of vanilla, a little bit of tannins, a little bit of tart fruit as well, the green fruit kind of coming through right on the finish. Not quite as estery as obviously the Holy Bourbon aged, but there is a little fruitiness there as well. Again, I think the balance is really nice on this. It's really good. I think it kind of is very... Does it say harvest? I don't know. I don't work on a farm, so it's very difficult for me to say that. But I can see what they're getting at. It's got a sort of like an earthiness, a sort of maybe a little bit of a rawness, and maybe that's deliberate, just to sort of emphasise that kind of harvesting of the barley, getting that sort of earth and fresh barley kind of, you know, notes, and no straw though. Don't get any straw or anything like that. So, but I like that. I think the balance in there is really good. So yeah, another good whiskey. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Fallow second crop, so Oloroso and PX casks. Oloroso and PX. So it's got that kind of gritty Oloroso character and a little bit of treacle, some soft black fruits, a little bit of cereal, walnuts, oat biscuit, tannins, oak tannins. Not a great deal of distillery character going on here, it has to be said, which is not a surprise really. Okay, so it is quite earthy, but I don't get a lot of earth. It's got that sort of, like I say, that kind of natural sort of Oloroso grittiness going on. So I can see where they're at with it. Like I said, I mean, it's not my cup of tea, as you well know, but it's clean, and it's going to appeal to you guys that love the sherry cask stuff, you know. So it is what it is at the end of the day. Let's see what the pals like. Quite silky, opens up with a little bit more PX kind of character. It has that sort of treacle silkiness. There's a little bit of herbal Oloroso, plenty of raisinated fruits. Again, that minerality is certainly noticeable, that citric minerality, obviously being enhanced by the alcohol, but it's definitely balancing the sherry richness. Again, not a huge amount of distillery character. There's possibly a semblance of barley and fruit there just on the finish, but I'm maybe kind of really looking for it quite hard. Again, I think it represents Fallow pretty well, it has to be said, and that is the point of this particular bottling. And as I said, it's not my kind of cup of tea, as you well know, but it's clean, and you know, the distilleries need a balanced portfolio. You need a sherry monster, I hate to say, because there are a lot of people that love them. So you're missing out on a sale or two if you don't have one. For me, you know, as you well know, I'm not the biggest fan of them. But clean, good quality, yeah, good whiskey. Okay, so on to the Ploughing edition second crop. Let's see what nose gives us on this one, shall we? So it's got that obvious medicinal peat character straight off the bat. But again, it's got some lovely estery white fruit. The distillery character is coming through quite strongly. There's some vanilla, green apple, touch of bog myrtle, again minerals, citrus, real freshness, a little astringency kind of coming in as well. I mean, yeah, I can kind of go with this about, you know, turning over the earth, getting things moving. Not as obvious on the peat as maybe the first batch, and I think that's because I think I'm correct in saying that there are no quarter casks used in the second crop, and therefore the peat is maybe a little bit sort of more subtle. Certainly I remember the first batch, the first crop being a lot more intense on the peat, and it's just surprising again how much influence the peat from the cask has, you know. But I like this. It's got a little bit of a soapiness, possibly a little bit of youthful spirit. I mean, again, you know, the spirit is 5-ish, you know, and although it's made in that kind of fruity estery character, it's still young. But it's, you know, I don't get bent out of shape about that. I think it's all, it kind of adds to the nose, if you like. So that's right. that's quite chewy in actual fact on the mid palate. Kicks off with capsicum and medicinal peat, herbal peat. Nice and sort of oily and full and fleshy and vanillaed on the mid palate. Again, minerals, white fruits, a little estery note, a little bit of bittering tannin on the finish. I like that. That's really nice. That's really balanced. And there's possibly a little bit more peat than you would expect from the nose on the palate, and it really lingers. It's kind of lingering in the edges of on the edges of my palate quite nicely, it has to be said. I like that. That's really impressive. But again, you've got to like your peated malts to sort of like that. You know, it's kind of the same with the sherry monster, isn't it? You know, if you don't like sherry monsters, then you're not going to like it. And if you don't like your peated malts, then you're not going to like it. But again, I kind of get the point. You know, it certainly says. It certainly says ploughing to me. It says kind of like, you know, earth, maybe a little bit more medicinal than overtly earthy, maybe. But I get it. It's cool. It's good. I like it. Right. Okay. So on to the first of the two age statement bottlings. I mean, I assume that once it gets to 10, they will probably have a core 10. So they'll have an R barley and hopefully maybe a sort of a 10-year-old version of R barley. I guess, I don't know. Anyway, let's see what the nose gives us on this, then, shall we? Quite a bit of sherry influence. It's got that sort of, again, treacle note, that sort of succulent, soft, dried fruits, plum, sweet plum, prune, herbal oloroso, a little bit of vanilla, touch of almost kind of red cherries kind of coming through. I know there's no STR cast, no wine cast, but there is a sort of a red cherry kind of note there. Chocolate, cereal. Not so much estery fruit, not so much minerality either. It does kind of sort of feel that the sherry is kind of blanketing that, but there is enough American oak aged spirit coming through to sort of balance that up. It's certainly not as heavy as the Fallow. I like that. It's got some lovely complexity, as we said, for just 5 years of age. And, you know, okay, there's 3 different cask types, I'll give you that. But those 3 casks have been, or 6 casks I should say, have chosen really well, and it's a lovely nose. Sure, pass on. That's really malty, really biscuity, earthy. Lots of treacle and raisinated fruits. There's a little bit of spice coming through there as well, and a little bit of vanilla on the mid palate. And as we get towards the finish, I'm getting a little bit of estery fruit, minerals again, citrus. Just about balanced, I think. It certainly is closer to the dark side than it is the light. And there it is, but that's it. That's Lochlea at 5 years of age, and it has got that lovely intensity and the youthfulness, but it's not spirity. It's not sort of marry. It's not, you know, raw. It has a lovely intensity. And yeah, I think that's just about sort of balanced. Like I said, a little bit heavy on the dark side, but yeah. Okay, so on to the final whisky of the afternoon. Just afternoon, not quite brewed for breakfast. So yes, American oak and Oloroso. Let's see what the nose gives on this. Well, you can tell there's no PX casks used here. It has that sort of more herbal Oloroso character, and the sherry is quite upfront, quite noticeable. It's chunky, it's grippy, quite tannic, and quite tight in actual fact. Raw cocoa, Not getting a huge amount of barley or distillery character, it has to be said. A little bit of almost kind of Sauternes-y kind of sweet sort of dried apricot, a little bit of almost kind of, yeah, a little bit of almost kind of not marzipan. Oh, I'm struggling here. It's marmalade. Oh, I knew it began with M. That was what I was trying to find. Yeah, a little bit of kind of dried orange peel marmalade. I'm not quite so warming to this one as the 5-year-old. I'm not getting enough distillery character. There is a little bit there, a little bit of vanilla, a little bit of esteriness, but I think I'm searching for it. It does seem that the Oloroso, and it's drying as well. It's herbal. It's drying Oloroso, and it's lacking the sweetness of the PX. I think the 5-year-old, for me, better vatting. I think I think if you're gonna go sherry heavy, put in a little bit of PX just to give it that kind of sweetness, that softness. It's just a little bit too austere, a little bit tight, I guess. That's what it sounds like. Now that's not what I was expecting. The palate kind of kicks off more with the American oak aged spirit. I'm getting more vanilla, I'm getting barley. Bitters quite hard on the finish, and again it just lacks a little bit of sweetness. And I think the thing is, when you taste it against the 5-year-old, that's the thing that you notice most of all. It lacks that little bit of sweetness, it lacks that PX, and it's quite dry, it's quite austere, and it's quite herbal. It's got some nice dried fruits, and like I said, I think I prefer the palate. In actual fact, given the nose, I wasn't expecting quite that much American oak influence spirit on the palate. I was expecting more of the herbal Oloroso, and yes, it's definitely there. I like the palate more, but I think personally, tasting the two against each other, I think I favour the 5-year-old slightly more than the 6. But either way, both really good. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. Big thank you to the distillery for the samples for today's episode of the show. And like I said from the word go, Lochlea is certainly a distillery that I've grown really fond of. It produces a lovely whiskey, a lovely spirit. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Firstly, a big thank you to the distillery for the samples for today's episode of the show. And like I said at the beginning, it's a distillery that I've grown really fond of. It produces a spirit that just really ticks all the boxes for me. And it has to be said, the Sowing edition it was my favourite at the end of the day. It was uncluttered, distillery character, American oak, and as you know, I am a purist. I want distillery character, and that had it in spades. And I could, to be fair, maybe with the exception of the Fallow, possibly, there was a distillery character evident, but you kind of need to know what you're looking for to a certain extent. But that bottling, and to a certain extent the our barley, is just a lovely whiskey, because it's kind of to a certain extent mirrors the harvest edition, and I love the fact that it's built around the distillery character with the casks augmenting. Yeah, alright, a little heavy on the casks, it has to be said, but you kind of got a lovely progression. I got the STR, I got the port, I got the American oak, and so I thought a really lovely bottling. The Fallow, like I said, not quite my cup of tea, a little bit too heavy on the sherry, not a surprise considering that's all it's been aged in, but again, it was kind of pandering to a certain bunch of people that maybe should oh God, you poor souls, forget the bloody sherry, please stop doing it, it's anyway. And then on to the ploughing. I thought the ploughing again was just really nicely balanced. Maybe a bit more medicinal than earthy, I suppose, given the fact that you know, you have the ex sort of Lefroy distillery manager on board. It's not a surprise you're going to get those kind of casks, and maybe it could have done with being maybe a bit more earthy, different distillery. I don't know, who knows. I mean, it was indicative. It was a lovely whiskey at the end of the day. I got plenty of the distillery character and esteriness and all that kind of stuff. The 5-year-old, I think, was my favourite of the two age statement bottlings, and hopefully when they do a 7-year-old, more American oak, please. You know, do a version. Here's what I would do. I would do a version of our barley as a 7-year-old. I would do basically American oak STR and judicious sherry. That's what I would do. I would build it around the American oak aged spirit. And just do something a little bit different, because the 6-year-old was just too much Oloroso, too herbal, not enough distillery character. It was a bit kind of, yeah, okay, I can see what you're doing here. But you know, if it was me, I would basically dial down the sherry, a couple of STR casks, maybe probably one. So I would probably do, if you're going to do 6 casks, I would probably do something like 3 American oak, 2 STR, 1 sherry. PX. Oh, okay, maybe. Oh, all right, okay. Do 7. All right, and then you can have a PX and an Oloroso. That's what I would do anyway. But you know, I'm not the master blender. I don't run the distillery. So, but there you go. That's my tuppence worth, if you like. So anyway, that's this week's episode of the Show in the Bag. I've loved it. Like I said, distillery, the Lochlea distillery is certainly a distillery that I've become very fond of. And when it's aged in American oak, it is absolutely gorgeous. So until next week, no idea what I'm going to be doing next week. Well, I kind of half an idea. Anyway, until then, good dramming and good afternoon.